In January 1945, the Soviet troops went on the offensive on a huge section of the front from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathians. In 20 days, the Red Army units covered more than 500 kilometers. Warsaw and Krakow were liberated, the fortresses of Breslau, Poznan and Königsberg were encircled. By the end of January, the Soviet troops captured the bridgeheads on the western bank of the Oder and were only 70 kilometers from Berlin. However, the Germans already had reserves here, hastily transferred from the Western Front. The attempt to continue the offensive and immediately take the city of Kustrin was unsuccessful. In the German headquarters, they saw that the First Belarusian Front had broken out far ahead, and Guderian offered Hitler a plan of counterattack from the eastern Pomerania on the flanks of the Soviet troops on the approach to Berlin. The operation conceived by Guderian received the codename of the Son of Standing. It began on February 15. Zhukov managed to repel the strike of the 11th Tank Army of the SS Felix Steiner, but Guderian could repeat the attempt, so it was quite risky to continue advancing on Berlin, and even more to set up flanks. It was necessary to wait for the troops of the neighboring fronts to pull up. Due to a lack of reserves, the advance of the Second Belarusian Front of Rokossovsky to the Baltic Sea was not going at a high pace. At the same time, Zhukov could not help his neighbors, since his troops were expanding the bridgehead on Odal and covering their flanks, repelling the counterattack of the enemy. As a result, the crisis that arose was resolved. Part of the First Belarusian Front, at Stalin's personal instruction, was still deployed to the north. With the joint strikes by Zhukov and Rokossovsky's troops, the enemy in this direction was defeated, and by mid-March, the First Belarusian Front leveled the front line on the northern flank. At the same time, the troops of the First Ukrainian Front of Konyev pulled up on the southern flank. Now it was possible to resume the offensive on Berlin, and Stalin did not want to delay it. By that time, the Germans had thrown all the reserves of the Western Front into the fight against the Red Army, as a result of which the Americans and the British quickly advanced towards Berlin, hardly meeting any serious resistance. If at the end of March the Allied troops were about 500 kilometers from the German capital, then by mid-April the front lines of the US Army reached the Elbe River. A little more than 80 kilometers remained from these borders to Berlin. Stalin was afraid that the Allies would capture the city first, and they really had such a desire. Churchill, who feared the strengthening of the Soviet Union after the war, offered to strike Berlin first, but the American generals did not agree with him. Nevertheless, they did not know the exact plans of the British and the Americans in Moscow, and preferred to hurry. Stalin believed that the Soviet Union, as a country that made the greatest contribution to the victory over Nazism, should own the capital of the Third Reich and put an important point in the war. The First Belarusian Front of Zhukov was to advance directly on Berlin. There were three powerful lines of defense on his way. On the long way to the city, the Germans created around their capital three more defensive rings: external, internal and city. Hitler undoubtedly believed that the super-strengthened defense of Berlin was impregnable. There was nothing like this, neither near Moscow, nor in Leningrad, nor in Stalingrad. It was really possible to be tied to such defense, so in the spring of 1945 Berlin was not the only goal for the Red Army. Part of Zhukov's troops was to bypass the city from the north and within 2 weeks go to the line of contact with the Allies at the Elbe border. In particular, it was planned to use the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, which were in the reserve of the Zhukov front. The Second Belarusian Front of Rokossovsky was to cover this advance from the north, and the First Ukrainian Front of Konyev was tasked with bypassing Berlin from the south and also to reach the Elbe in the shortest possible time. If successful, the eastern part of Germany would be under the control of the Red Army. To take Berlin, the Soviet command concentrated 42,000 guns, more than 6,000 tanks and 7,500 combat aircraft. Millions of tons of shells, fuel and food were sent to the front in an endless stream. These forces, in their power, significantly exceeded everything that Hitler managed to collect for the last decisive battle. The groups of the Army of Wiesel and Zentr opposed the three Soviet fronts. Their advance from the southeast of Berlin was covered by the 9th Army under the command of General Theodor Bussy, occupying, among other things, the Zyalov Heights. The Soviet offensive began on the night of April 16, 1945. After a powerful aviation artillery preparation, the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts took the offensive. The Zhukov troops advanced 1.5 to 2 kilometers ahead in the first hours of the offensive. But with the approach to the second line of defense, which passed through the Zyalov Heights, the resistance of the enemy increased sharply. Despite the most powerful artillery preparation, most of the firing points behind the thick concrete walls of the pillboxes mostly survived. The offensive began to slip. By the second half of the day, Zhukov realized that one infantryman could not take the heights and threw into battle his main reserves, the 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies. Thus, he violated the directive of the general headquarters, which prescribed to use these formations exclusively to bypass Berlin from the north. This led to the conversation of the commander-in-chief in high tones. Subsequently, Zhukov and Stalin did not communicate for 3 days at all. Meanwhile, Zhukov was waiting for a rapid development of success. However, the persistent battles at the Zyalov Heights without serious promotion continued on April 17 and 18. The headquarters began to look for a solution to the existing problems. Zhukov had nothing to help with. He used his main reserves, and all that remained was to wait for him to succeed. But the affairs of the First Ukrainian Front were much better. Therefore, for the immediate capture of the German capital, the Lelishenko and Rybalko tank armies decided to turn from Elba to the north. By the end of April 21, Konyev's troops broke through all 3 lines of defense of the enemy, forced the Spree River and in a matter of hours broke through to the southern suburbs of Berlin. By this time, Zhukov's troops still managed to break through the defense of the enemy near the Zyalov Heights, and they also rushed to the capital of the Third Reich. The 9th Wehrmacht Army, which held the front on the Oder, was divided into 3 parts. The German defense, which Goebbels called an impregnable wall, could not withstand a powerful blow and began to fall apart. On April 20, on his 56th birthday, Hitler woke up to the rumble of the explosions of Soviet howitzers. He hid in a bunker specially built for him in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, and the next day the Soviet troops broke into the streets of Berlin. Fierce street battles began. The city was literally turned into a fortress. Defense was built on strong support points and resistance nodes, in which all massive stone buildings, bomb shelters and casemates, connected by underground communications, were located. Part of the Berlin streets, as well as approaches to the bridges through the canals, were blocked by massive barricades. Approaches to them were mined, 24 tanks were buried at the intersections of the roads as immobile firing points. Trying to postpone their end, the German commander did not throw all the remaining forces into battle. The main participants in the street battles were assault groups, consisting of an artillery battalion, platoons of sappers, and a division of flamethrowers, which were given several guns, tanks, or self-propelled guns. In some cases, the fire support was provided by batteries of heavy guns, as well as by divisions of Katyush. Tank men moved forward, covering each other, conducting crossfire on both sides of the street. The self-propelled guns, which followed them at a distance of 30 meters, destroyed the suppressed firing points. Artillerymen were aiming at the windows and embrasures with direct fire. On April 22, Hitler's headquarters decided to transfer the 12th Army of General Walter Wemke to the aid of the 9th Army, which was almost cut off from the city. It was the last attempt of the Wehrmacht to influence the course of the battle. On April 24, Wemke's army delivered a series of blows, which were successfully repelled. On the same day, Hitler appointed General Hermann Weidling as the head of defense of Berlin, but this could no longer affect the situation. The battle was approaching the city center. Meanwhile, at the order of Stalin, all units of Konyev, who did not participate in the battle for Berlin, were thrown to Elba. On April 25, they met with the troops of the First Army of the United States. Thus, Germany was divided into 2 parts. The remnants of the 9th Army of the Wehrmacht were encircled in the forests to the southeast of Berlin. Now the capital of the Reich was defended by separate detachments of SS, cadets of military schools and Volkssturmer recruits. The center of the efforts of the Red Army units was the Reichstag, the building of the German parliament, which was considered the main symbol of the Third Reich. The closer the Soviet strike groups penetrated the center of the city, the more fierce the resistance became. The Red Army widely used the rich experience of street battles acquired in Stalingrad, Budapest, and Königsberg. The storm of the city went day and night. All efforts were aimed at preventing the enemy from organizing strong defense and securing new positions. Already on April 28, the Red Army in a number of areas broke the defense of the central sector of the German capital. The 3rd Strike Army of Kuznetsov, which occupied the area of Mobit, went to the Spree of the northern central part of the Tiergarten Park. The units of the 5th Strike Army of Berzerin, which came from the east, took Karlshorst, forced the Spree, occupied the Angalski railway station and the building of the state printing house. The 8th Guard Army of Chukov broke through along the southern bank of the Landwehr Canal, which was the last major barrier on the way to the government quarter. From here to the Reich Chancellery there were only 2 kilometers left. By this time, Hitler finally decided to end himself. On April 28, he dictated his political will. He appointed the Reich President Gross Admiral Dönitz, and the Reich Chancellor was Goebbels. The next day, Wang reported that his army was encircled and would not be able to break through to Berlin. Soon the last connection line with Hitler's bunker was destroyed. On April 30th, around 3 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. On the same day, the Red Army men broke into the Reichstag. After several attempts to storm, only in the evening of May 1st, Germans laid down their arms in the basements of the Reichstag. On the dome of the Reichstag there was a storm flag of the 150th Hitler's Rifle Division, which later became the banner of victory. Fights in separate areas of Berlin continued for another day. By the evening of May 2nd, the resistance of the Germans was finally broken. The commander of Berlin, Weidling, came to the headquarters of the 8th Guards Army of General Chukov and accepted the proposal of the Soviet commandment to capitulate the German units. Mass surrender began. Separate German units, which did not want to surrender, tried to break through to the west through the suburbs of Berlin-Spandau and were soon destroyed. In total, more than 130,000 people were taken prisoner. On May 3rd, the fighting in Berlin stopped. Our soldiers were rejoicing. It was a long-awaited victory. All Soviet tanks were immediately decorated with red flags. Soldiers danced, sang and shot all kinds of weapons into the sky. They were photographed in memory, against the background of the defeated Reichstag. During the Berlin offensive, the military-political leadership of the Third Reich was destroyed, which subsequently led to the total capitulation of the armed forces of the country. The main forces of the Wehrmacht were destroyed. The German commandment actually lost the opportunity to continue the war. Despite the fact that by 1945 Germany had lost its strategic initiative, it fought persistently until the last days. The victory over the formidable enemy was a huge strain on the Soviet Union of all forces. In total, 80,000 Red Army soldiers died in the battles for Berlin. The Germans lost 800,000 people, a significant part of whom were wounded and captured. About 100,000 Wehrmacht soldiers died. In Czechoslovakia, the Wehrmacht still had an almost million-strong, quite combat-capable group. However, when two tank armies of the First Ukrainian Front began to move rapidly towards Prague and the ways to the west were blocked, the Germans began to surrender en masse. On the night of May 9, at the Berlin level, an act was signed on the unconditional surrender of the armed forces of Fascist Germany, which, on the instructions of the Soviet government, was adopted by Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The war, which lasted almost 4 years and cost the Soviet people unbearable suffering, finally ended victoriously.